So, Paul, I know I've seen a little bit of your videos. I know a little bit about you. Would it be helpful? I don't want to start this interview off with, or this conversation off with just me talking about myself, but would it be helpful to kind of give you a little bit of a backstory just to kind of
Yes.
lead
Yep.
us into this conversation?
Yep. That'd be great.
Okay, cool. So, a little bit about my background. I grew up in the evangelical world, kind of the nominal evangelical South. It was an actual nothing was really lived. It was just more about like, practice of tradition of like, this is what you do on Sundays or whatever. Ended up graduating and with a modern dance degree. I went to school for dance. Just out of curiosity, I was interested in the arts. I started dancing later in life. I played sports all my life and got into that, and that opened me up to maybe postmodernism or questioning things or asking, you know, um, being curious. And right when I was going to graduate, I started asking questions about the Bible. I said, is this thing really true? Like, I mean, true in the sense of like, is it valid? Is it important? Is it meaningful? Does it matter? The way that it did to the people that were writing it, the events that you see happening in the Bible seem so different than what I was seeing in my life. And I was like, this just seems so different. And so essentially, I just asked a question. I was like, okay, well, what in this book is still relevant and what could we learn from it or what could be relevant. And it was then that I had this kind of this moment. It was just a numinous moment of just knowing. I saw a flyer for an audition in New York, and I had no interest in the company, but I was like, I'm going to go do that. I'm supposed to go, so I bought a one way bus ticket, gave away everything that I owned. um, had no idea where I was going to stay, what I was going to do when I got there. Had literally about $80 to my name, and just took off and got dropped off in the middle of Chinatown. And one of the first things that happened was I gave away a water bottle. I had a water bottle. I gave it away to this homeless lady, and I just kind of said a very humble prayer of like, well, I need a water bottle. It's like I got to drink water, so I need a water bottle. And later that day, I'd written it down. I was like, okay, praying for this water bottle. And then later that day, I was I was in a place and this guy comes up to me randomly and he's like, "This is gonna sound really weird, um, but do you would I feel like I'm supposed to give you this water bottle." And I just I just kind of froze. I didn't know what to say. I was just kind of in just awestruck. My everything just kind of collapsed on me, and it was the exact same water bottle that I gave away, but I had a smiley face on it. And something shifted big time, and I began to open up, and I just was like, "I'm gonna ask questions. Nothing's off the table. I'm gonna go anywhere, talk to anybody, do anything or whatever." And that led me on a year's journey around the United States. I went all over, lived in New Orleans, Colorado, Los Angeles, uh, Upper Portland, and then I finally wound up in Vegas. And so Vegas was essentially where I ended up staying. Met a group of guys. We started doing stuff with the homeless, helping out, and one thing led to another. We ended up accidentally starting a nonprofit. We were just doing meals for the homeless, and then started getting a lot of people, a lot of buzz, a lot of things were happening. A church, we were partnered with a church, and they were like, well, let's get a space. So we got a space, and then we started doing, it grew to where we were doing about 1,000 people a month. We're coming through, getting food, clothes, resources, whatever. Well, during that time, I'd seen all sorts of kind of crazy stuff on this journey that it was like opening me up to questions about um, more so the unexplainable phenomenon that you see in the Bible. And it was there that we started doing intakes. I started sitting down with people. Um, and what we would do is just ask some questions and do some basic stuff before they would come in, and then they would get their food and their clothes and whatever. And so I started doing like basic prayers, just like we can't meet all your needs, but we'll pray for whatever you need. And that was just kind of how it went. And I began to get curious, and I realized that I was like, I'm tired of just kind of asking for just random stuff. It just felt like I was praying to a distant. So I was like, I'm going to change the approach, and I started just asking for a divine light whatever you want to call it, God, just to touch them, and just to be in this moment with them and give them whatever they needed, right? And as I started doing that, very strange stuff started to happen. Just stuff that was like I didn't really have a reference guide for. It was very odd. Um, and then it started to get more and more intense. People would start to sweating, or they'd fall down, or they'd pass out, or I had one lady hit the ground and just lay there for 10 minutes, and I didn't know what was going on. She eventually got up and she told us the experience, and it was really impactful. But long story short, what ended up happening shortly after was people began to have these I didn't use this language then, but these archetypal eruptions where they would begin to speak in different voices. They'd begin to say things and say information they couldn't have known, and people that were illiterate, uneducated, that just there's no way they could have had this insight, would begin to say stuff, very detailed stuff, and then we begin to see all sorts of just very very wild stuff, and so that really shook me, and I was like, okay, this is really powerful, and what I quickly realized was the church had a very specific definition for what was going on. They had language, but what I noticed, this church was connected with the Evangelical Southern Baptist Convention, and I think it was the Neil T. Anderson. They had some stuff from
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that whole model, and I started to see this kind of this dissonance of like, I started to see this thing that was like felt off. It felt like it was overstretching certain ways or categorizing things in ways that I just began to be resistant to. And then I saw
Mhm,
other things within the church, including stuff that happened to myself, and kind of distanced myself from it. I was like, I don't really
mhm.
want to be a part of that. Started asking other questions, and then I eventually left that altogether. I was like, I don't want to be a part of any organized religion. Went into real estate, made a lot of money, was very successful, but the problem with seeing stuff like that is it doesn't go away.
Yeah,
And it gets really hard to, show people closets when you're thinking about all that, all of those other things that you've experienced. And so
yeah.
that's what inevitably that daemon or that calling or whatever you want to call it pulled me back into this path and this pursuit. Um, Back to where my PhD work now is in transpersonal psych, Jungian psychology, depth psychology, but it's you know based in religions, philosophy, spirituality, all that. And what I quickly noticed is that a lot of the literature that I was running into wasn't really being written from experience. It was kind of being written about a thing, or trying to psychologize it or put it into a category that was like, okay, this is flat. This is very flat,
Yeah.
and this is not quite complete. Which inevitably led me to the train uh, of Young and archetypes, IFS a little bit, and then Vervaeke has been kind of what I've really uh, not couched it all in, but like I've kind of tied myself to that as a really good train of the 4E Coxeye model. I think is a way to help becoming unmoored. I mean, I've seen a lot of people kind of go down rabbit trails with what we're going to talk with what we're talking about, and so I've sensed from Vervaeke a real openness to talk about this stuff. And I think the grammar and the language is really good. Um, in a lot of ways, and I think that the pursuit of where he's going with it has been something that I've been very tied to. And I just feel like you were somebody that I'm very excited to maybe open this up and kind of see where it takes us, because I feel like this conversation amongst the zeitgeist is something that is becoming very relevant and very necessary that we develop this grammar. And so, yeah, I mean, that's like a real brief introduction to all of this. Hopefully, it gives you enough to where we can kind of start from. And just to kind of see, where I'm curious as to kind of where you're at. I watched a video of you talking about, I don't know if this was a few months ago, maybe, but you were kind of discussing at a societal level and then at a personal level. And I was getting, these shades of kind of what you were looking at. So I'm curious as to kind of, um, yeah, just to throw. I said a lot, so uh, I'd love to jump in with you here.
Well, I'll first say that while I've had some experience with, um, let's say this kind of reality at an individual level, a lot of the thinking that I was doing about it sort of over the last few months, over the last few years, really, in conjunction with the conversations that I've had with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot, have been at sort of a higher level. Um, there's no question to me about the reality um, of spiritual entities at an individual level. I mean, this is I'm just actually right now over the last couple days making my way through the 4-part series that The Rest is History did on Joan of Arc.
Mm,
Very interesting figure.
I was just watching a video about Joan of Arc yesterday. I don't know
Yeah,
why. I just randomly
yeah,
was like, I want to watch this.
yeah.
So sh-
Very. I didn't really know much of the story or the history of it, and it's a very interesting story. I mean, she clearly believed, clearly believed that God was sending her messages. Yet it wasn't exactly clear to me, how these voices identified themselves, if they were messengers from God, et cetera, et cetera.
You said
And of
Michael,
course,
right? Or did it say Mike
yeah,
at one
yeah,
point? She
yeah.
was identified as
And
Michael.
so she, obviously was involved with some dramatic things that turned the tide in the Hundred Years' War, but in the end, becomes a very complex story because she doesn't win Paris, and she, for a while, her narrative sort of peaks and then goes down, and then, it gets even more complex. And none of that surprises me. And on one hand, it's not at all uncommon, especially if you're working with a population like the homeless population. It's a very the that population is not at all sort of moored by so many things that moors those of us who have physical addresses and pay taxes and opened our mail and all of these things. I mean, I would often I'd often receive the mail of a homeless friend of mine here at the church, and I'd get a huge stack of it, and some of it looked semi important, and I'd give it to him and be like, you know, doesn't doesn't read mail. I mean, just completely untethered.
Yeah.
But lots of interesting things happen. But that's sort of at the individual level, and there's a lot of focus for what happens at the individual level, and you can see that in the biblical corpus. A lot of exorcisms in the Gospels. You find them in the Book of Acts. They're but then the New Testament also talks about other levels of spiritual involvement in what today we would categorize, let's say, in the political realm. And it is a remarkable thing when you read history how, we've developed language for it, such as zeitgeist, which in English is sort of removed from, Geist, of course, Holy Ghost. That's, this translation that comes down into English. That's the Geist. But the German Geist isn't exactly ghost, it's much more spirit. And you see these waves of influence. We have all sorts of circumlocutions around them. But the New Testament will not be anywhere near as bashful about using, sort of understanding agency at this realm than we do. In the last few years, this word egregore has sort of come to the fore in certain circles,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
about spirits that, and the nice sort of the nice thing about the egregore term, at least how it's been understood right now, is that these are things that we as human beings are collectively generating to the best of our degree. But part of that directionality clearly is something that's a product of certain communal philosophical assumptions about materiality, how materiality is most real, and other things are sort of emergent from that. So there's a whole lot going on there, but actually finding a language or a framework that that um that is helpful to kind of get a handle on it, especially in terms of agency, because while there's a tremendous amount of interest by the most powerful, the most wealthy, the commanding heights of our culture, there's a tremendous amount of interest to wield these things, because everything that you see happening on
Or to
mass
partner
media,
with.
or to partner with on mass media or social media to influence
Yeah.
sort of the zeitgeist. Um, it always is in many ways beyond our grasp.
Yes.
You see points in time when things sort of move, but then they're always going in directions that are unforeseen
Well,
and
and
non-controlled.
so, but I think that's what, to me, it's really interesting you think about phenomenology, or kind of what Jung was getting at with this idea of, and maybe it's a little Kantian, but at the same time, I think it's pragmatics of IFS, where you talk about the individual level, and this is what I was talking with Kazra about. It's like getting to that metaphysical understanding is certainly interesting. It's something to do for sure, and I think it could be beneficial in certain ways, absolutely. But I also think that there is a reality of the accessibility of language towards what we even have access to, meaning our connection to these archetypes and how we are aware of the relationships. And that's why, again, I like Vervaeke, because I feel like he does a really good job of not becoming. I think it's very easy, and you mentioned egregores, and I've noticed this with the Steiner school and all of there's all sorts of different metaphysical rabbit trails that anybody could go down when we're talking about this stuff, that ends up pushing you into this metaphysical space of, it could be true, it could be false. There's really no way of necessarily knowing exactly until it plays out in an embodied way. And that's when it's like, okay, well, so I would rather go, okay, well, let's look at the embodied realities of what we're actually dealing with. And you mentioned the homeless, and I've always, or I say disenfranchised too. It's like, I think the ego development, or that ego weakening of not having the ability to unparse yourself from that a collective energy, is what I noticed when people would get, where you would see the quote unquote classical possession states. Now, I've also seen people that have very developed egos, but also have burdens and different parts, or different attachments, that are just susceptible to the energy, that you'll never know that it's flowing through. And so I see that showing up amongst with what you were talking about. And I think the scary part about that, in a lot of ways, is that you know you, you can participate in that very, very much unconsciously and
Yeah.
unknowingly. And I think that, to me, and one of the things I would be really interesting in, like, diving into, is, does the church have a cultural grammar that is up to the challenge of meeting where we're at with the increased level of archetypal collective energy? Like, I just feel like that, I have my own thoughts, but I'm
Yeah.
curious to hear your opinion on that, because I I'm not sure.
When I look at an individual situation and someone, I mean, we can you can look at something like alcoholism, and you can watch that say derail someone's life. And then you can look at the far less common experiences of, um, what in the church would be called demon possession, extremely rare. But again, these things have a power to derail an individual's life fairly quickly. And that whole segment is, I think, in some ways mapped. How well it's mapped, I don't know, but you can find Orthodoxy mapping it, you can find Catholicism mapping it, you can find Pentecostal Protestantism mapping it. And so I've not paid as much attention to that as, say, let's look at something like, and we've even given it a name, a political name, and let's call it, Trump derangement syndrome, where now what I've noticed is, and I want to sort of disconnect this from the political, if that's possible in the conversation, but it is phenomenal to me the way that how much this one man has possessed his adversaries. Now he's possessed some of his followers as well, but to me the focus is on, okay, how about the people who hate him, the people who, almost everything in their worldview is sort of, I mean, he is possessing a large group of people, and unlike the kinds of people that we see, let's say, struggling with individual oppression or possession, um, this guy is possessing an incredible number of people, and in some ways, I think stealing their agency. And to the degree that it's I mean, it's sort of captivating at time. Now, part of the reason why it's a nice example to talk about is there is there is an end date to this. And it is at whatever point he ceases to become president, or he passes away or whatever. And recently there have been some conversations about Hitler in terms of Alec Ryrie, who was a church historian out of Durham, UK. Basically talks about the age of Hitler, how in a very interesting way Hitler became an archetype and has possessed a civilization to the degree that he's supplanted the devil. Now, I don't know that Donald Trump will get to those kinds of heights in terms of that sort of power of possession. And it's not, I mean, to the degree that Donald Trump himself is participating in this, I don't know. And I don't, but it's just fascinating the way, let's say, Adolf Hitler has sort of possessed possessed an entire civilization in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I can look at individual cases where on a pastoral level, I would say, yeah, this person should really get into a 12-step program. This person might even need a full-blown exorcism to get delivered from that. But these are tiny little individual cases that, for the most part, aren't really moving a lot of lives. But this other layer, civilizationally, is, it's tremendously significant. It's causing wars, billions, it moves billions of dollars. When you talk about how it gets instantiated, it moves elections, and those elections have consequences geopolitically. So at a certain layer, something is happening there, and I will find people who are very functional, well educated, doing okay in terms of family and social settings, just completely deranged temporarily in certain segments by this, to the point that all you have to do is say a name, and that name means something. And part of why this is interesting for me is because the New Testament has language about Jesus disarming the principalities and powers. That's the language that the New Testament uses. Now, you can look at a lot of skeptical atheists out there and ask questions like, well, what did Jesus really do? But if you look at it, let's say, through the lens of, Tom Holland has not been the only one who has made these points, but when you look at his argument in the Book of Dominion, he basically has the thesis that Jesus of Nazareth, whatever you think of, his ontology or his divinity, Jesus of Nazareth has fundamentally colonized the world's moral imagination to the point that new atheists have made a for at least for a little while, their stock seems to be declining. But they made a pretty handy living on basically arguing that Christianity and the church has insufficiently promoted the morality of Jesus. And you continue to find this. And so it's quite clear that Jesus unleashed something spiritual into the world that has been rolling through human history in an incredible, powerful way for 2 millennia. Adolf Hitler unleashed something in our moral imagination. And Alec Ryrie does a nice job of noting that this really doesn't get going until like the 80s and 90s. Because if you look at Nazism as it's treated in form in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, there's in a sense a lot more realism to it. The characters they're recognizably human instead of archetypal. Whereas if you look at, let's say, more recent film portrayals of Nazis, they've become incredibly archetypal and less human. And so you just watch these things roll through. And if you ask, do we have a language sufficient for it? I'd say no. Are there, is there, are there, do we have dormant, do we have dormant language from, let's say, the New Testament? Or again, in looking at the Joan of Arc situation, they clearly, that they were really trying to map Joan of Arc using their categories. Okay, she cross-dressed, so Deuteronomy is against that. And then it was sort of through the political lens. Obviously the English alliance saw her as a witch, and the French nativists saw her as a saint. And I haven't finished sort of going through it or looking at when her canonization was, but Joan of Arc is just a really interesting case study because now at, let's say, the last major iteration, which was, let's say, the medieval period, they did look at her through a lens. And by virtue of the distance, we see through that lens differently. But you can see that there is past civilizations have had language about this. And what I think is coming as we're sort of leaving the modern period that wanted to, let's say, demythologize a lot of the language. Well, Donald Trump has influence.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has ideas. I mean,
Yeah.
those are that's very demythologized language. And I think what we'll probably see is a lot more awareness of agency in terms of that which is even colonizing people that one might say have Trump derangement syndrome
Yeah.
or are sort of possessed by a certain spirit of Adolf Hitler that really came to the fore 40 years after after he took his own life or however he died.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know your church or your experience with Christianity. That's why I'm excited to talk to you, because I think mine has been shaped by obviously a certain type of experience. But I would say that the amount of not only materialism and enlightenment that has, and then, Protestantism of like Baptist Protestantism of where we have these things in name. But what I've noticed is that it's really interesting to me, coming from a world where I do this psychosomatic work or psychospiritual work. Um, I've set with these energies, these archetypes, these forces. Um, and I get what you're saying about the archetypal nature or the symbolic nature of Christ, how powerful that is. Even when you look at other, I've looked into Hinduism and other types of tantric practices where they have ways of working with different things, and I know that's like, well, going by my experience, this pattern is very, very potent very potent because it has this power to break up these false connections of love where people will associate certain things with love, certain broken, chaotic, fragmented things that get attached to love that now become this thwarted view. And what I've noticed in, a lot of the stuff that I post is on Instagram, it's taken off. And I've noticed that within mainstream Christianity, there is this, and I saw this within the Charlie Kirk Memorial, where there was this call to follow Jesus. And you have all of these people after this very intense propagandized speech about, we don't even need to go into all that, giving their life to Christ. Now, what Christ are they given? It's like, what initiation is happening in this moment? And I see people using the name of this language. You're talking about demons, spiritual warfare, but it's almost been taken to a totally subcategory where it has the appearance of the name of Jesus. It has the appearance of church language, like you're talking about, and yet the true understanding or discernment or archetypal awareness, both within and without, I see is completely not. It's just not there. It's not existent in so many ways, and I find this is very problematic. And I think one of the biggest issues as to why, certain things can organize so quickly, because I think you get people that are like, oh, well, that's got the name of what I, should believe, or what I, am comfortable with, or whatever. And then all the Trojan horse of everything else starts to come in after it. And that's why I wonder if this idea of and I really like Bob Falconer's book, and I don't know if you've read it, but I've approached it like this myself, where I was given this whole idea of demonic exorcism, casting out, sending to hell, that that type of language, that battle language. And I'm not saying there isn't chaotic, malevolent forces, but I've seen a lot of what he's saying in this idea of letting God be the judge of what is on the other side of that, and getting out of this battle and into this, hey, you have the opportunity to go towards the light, or you can go somewhere else. But that's the way he's dealing with what they call unattached burdens, and or
Yeah.
what and
Yeah.
so for me, it's like, I've just noticed the amount of experience, research, time that it's taken me to dig into what it means to work, with this type of force, or these energies or archetypes, whatever you call them. And I know you have a scalability thing here that you have, that that you think of, but I'm not sure that the current model within the religious organizations, I don't even know what the bridge to get there
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah.
And that brings me into sectarianism and some of these things where I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this stuff, because I know you're a pastor, and um yeah, so I mean, and I know you or have a close relationship with Vervaeke, and so those worlds, I'm wondering,
Yeah.
where are we landing at the core of all this? Are we on the same team? Are we yes, we're on the team, but like secretly we're not on the team? I
Well,
don't know.
let me say something this way. Jesus walks around the Galilee, and he will regularly provoke or encounter individuals with what the New Testament calls unclean spirits. There's one incident where Jesus is teaching in a synagogue, and an unclean spirit stands up and declares him as the Son of God. Jesus tells him to be quiet, casts out the spirit, resolved. Another time, Jesus and his disciples are traveling across the Galilee. They're in a Gentile space, and there's a man with an unclean spirit who the town has basically, it's basically walled him away from the town because he's so disordered and he's showing such powerful manifestations. And Jesus comes and delivers him, and the man wants to follow him, and Jesus says, no, go back to your own people and tell them what God has done for you. Okay, these are the individual layer. And Jesus seems to these are things that Jesus does in an instant, resolves nearly immediately, delegates to his disciples, and in most cases, his disciples can resolve them. There's one famous case where his disciples couldn't, and Jesus kind of sighs, leans in, takes care of it. Those kind of things, Jesus can sort of he can just do those without any problem. Now, what does it take Jesus centuries to accomplish? Now, when you're talking about, let's say, civilizational level constructs, we can use that word construct. It'd be a very secular word that people are comfortable with. We can say civilizational level spirits. Jesus can talk a demon out of an individual with a word. Jesus can't talk his rivals out of something much deeper that holds them without it costing him his life. What's with that? So it's a very interesting dynamic that Jesus can do all kinds of amazing things in the Gospels. If you believe it, that Jesus can still a storm, he can raise the dead, he can cause the lame to walk, he can cast out demons. Jesus can do all these things for individuals, and it changes them. But the kinds of civilizational level spirits that we're looking at seem to function at a different scale and over different periods of time. It doesn't mean they don't possess people and people don't behave in certain ways. But we don't even see that so much as possession. Yet, if you look at, let's say, what prompted people to be guards in, Nazi concentration camps, and many of these people were raised Protestant or Catholic, you know, what would prompt people, even, the inventor, there's a really interesting book out called The Alchemy of Air, where it goes into the chemist that both works out the fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere, which is incredibly important for both the production of artificial fertilizer and production of explosives. He's also the inventor of the gas that Hitler will use in his death camps, and he's a Jew. And he sort of renounces his Jewishness and sort of becomes fully German, gets baptized in the church. In other words, you have these much slower civilizational spirits
Mhm.
that shape the world and that inhabit churches and communities and societies and nations. And again, if you read back onto, there's this interesting little moment in the book of Daniel where, an angel is trying to get to visit Daniel, but he's blocked by the prince of Persia. I mean, and just that one line just sends, people off into all kinds of different ways. But I think it's telling to look at the fact that Jesus can still a storm with a word, but that which was possessing the uh, Jesus' own people in especially Judea, Jesus cries on the Mount of Olives on his way down to, on one hand, his triumphal entry and then his arrest and crucifixion. Jesus weeps on top of the mountain because, unlike the unclean spirits that he can just dispatch with a word, or a storm that he can dispatch with a word, or even someone's death that he can resolve with a thought, this is taking a lot more.
Yeah.
And it's and Jesus doesn't cast it in the same language as the unclean spirits, or at least, of course, his Jesus witnesses who wrote the Gospels. They don't cast it in that language. But when you begin to read the Apostle Paul, Paul sort of points to ideas that are imagining that what Jesus had done is going to take time to actually begin to change. And then you talk about seeing it in an embodied way. Well, paganism goes away. and a new thing begins to inhabit. Now that's going to be tremendously
Yeah.
complex. And if you ask about, you can go into, I mean, far longer time than we have right now about the strange history of American evangelicals with respect to all these things.
Yeah.
And it has to sort of go through the modernist fundamentalist fork and then adaptations but that get applied. But it's, when you see something like the Charlie Kirk funeral, you're looking at you're definitely looking at something spiritual. Now, how it's framed, where it is, what it is, again, you can look at the Joan of Arc situation and you can see two opposing spiritual views, even through one sort of shared metaphysic on
Yeah.
how to understand this young French maiden who inspires, the side of a French Civil War that seemed to be able to do nothing but lose into victory. And then,
Yeah, and you have
her
one
strange
church
story.
in one church, she's a hero, and in another church, they're condemning her based on the political view that they're based on what side of the battle they're on, in a sense as well.
But I wouldn't say, I mean, that sounds a little more cynical. I'd say they sincerely look at, well, she's hearing voices. She's dressing like a man. She's not acting in a way, it must be
Right.
witchcraft. And this divide also possesses the Protestant Reformation. If you look at if you want to read a very interesting book, Carlos Eyre, Eire, has a book called They Flew, and he sort of goes
Oh, yeah,
through
yeah,
these flying monks
yeah,
and
yeah, I've
flying
seen it.
nuns of the
Yeah.
late of the early modern period. And it's interesting this happens in the early modern period. And so, but again, those are sort of the individual cases, which I think part of the reason they fascinate us is because of the much more secular, demythologized worldview that the West inhabited for certain reasons. But the much larger question about why can Jesus cast out a spirit with a word, but he will stand weeping on the Mount of Olives because he can't seem to, with a word, cast out the spirits that are possessing the collective that is in fact going to crucify him.
Well, I would what that makes me think of, though, also is, like, I think, like, you could also couch or, like, people have talked about this in other terms. I mean, Jungian, the individuation of, the way that the unconscious has moved throughout history, the way that God moves throughout history, the way that the minds, the philosophy of mind talks a lot about this. There's all sorts of ideas around that process, both individually and collectively, of, and some have been pseudo religious, of Marxism and Hegelianism, and just these ideas where there's something happening that's moving, in these patterns take longer than other patterns to move and to adjust. But again, I go back to this idea of, okay, well, I see the nature of apocalypse through Christ. You see the true, and we know what we're talking about, and I think anybody and your listeners would know the true nature of apocalypse, of the unveiling within Christ and within the new thing that was happening into society. But I guess what I keep looking at now is, like, the collapse of the apocalypse into the construction of creed. And I want to be careful when I say this, because I don't mean this in a negative light. I think that, much of the dogma that formed around it was simply preservation of not wanting to get killed. I mean, I look at that in that light. I'm not one of those people that think it's like, oh, this is, it's been downhill ever since the original version. But I think there is a nature within the ego that's like, okay, like, let's construct the stability around what we're doing here. And I do sense what you're talking. There's these patterns that are always kind of deconstructing, reconstructing, emerging, a new thing being done. The Christ of, what is the apocalypse today? What is the unveiling looking like today? And I guess where I fall back is not a denial of, the Christ, because I think that is actually, I would be in agreement with you. I think there's something that's happened beyond anything else that I've seen. Um, but I guess the pragmatics of that, the language of that, the unwinding of the new paradigms and the new models and the whatever that looks like moving forward, I go back to this idea of what level of language are we going to be precious, like are we going to preserve, and what is required. And we talk about John Vervaeke, and we look at what his project is. I look at what Faulkner's project is. I think about my feeling of how I feel a personal relationship with Christ just through experience, and like let go of propositional beliefs, like just from the phenomenological of like the death and resurrection in my own life. I can't deny that. That's a reality that just is. However, I see the propositional tyranny that's kind of evading us, or that's kind of moving throughout the culture. And I'm just like, is this equipped, or does the apocalypse look like a new language beyond certain ideas? And I think that's where I have a hard time. Like I've listened to Pajot talk, and I've I'm in that lane. My work is the symbolic and the imaginal, and I'm in that lane. Like 98% of what he talks about, I'm like, I'm right there, and I see what he's doing and what he's in agreement. But then there's certain times where he'll talk about Levin's work. I heard him, and I don't know what video this was, but it was right after he did a video with Levin, and then he was on another podcast where it was like there was a lot of suspicion about what he was doing, and there was this kind of this apprehensiveness, and it was like, oh well, I don't know, and I that kind of made me feel like what are we talking about here then?
Yeah.
And then maybe that's some hurt in me that's also probably feeling like growing up in that evangelical um propositional only, I don't know how else to say it, but it's just like maybe a skepticism in a sense of like I feel like we're agreeing on almost everything, but then at the end of the day, the movement forward into working with these patterns, working with this thing, like does that make sense what I'm kinda getting
I
at?
think I understand what you're pointing to. I think Vervaeke is my read of what happens in the modern period is that we sort of overheat and overreach with the propositional in order to achieve some things that we really wanted. And what we really wanted was a a better systems to understand, organize, and wield the material layer. And that's what modernity does. It it intentionally sort of it takes out the personal and then says, okay, if we impersonal, or we could say demythologize, if we demythologize this and act as if materiality functions in this way. I call it the scientific lab leak. We basically take what simple cause and effect things, and we try to take that lens and see everything through it. Just recently, Alex O'Connor and David Bentley Hart had a conversation, and it was a really good conversation. And that David Bentley Hart did I think, a good job in talking about how that Vervaeke's mentioned this, one of his friends who wrote The Blind Spot, if in order to do this trick, you take out the personal, but then if you try to approach the personal with this trick, you begin to recognize that, wait a minute, you have a problem with that because you've intentionally excluded that which you're now using to try to study that which you intentionally excluded because that was causing you difficulty. So modernity does this, and we have benefited in a lot of ways greatly. We're not dying of cholera. We have electricity. We have all of this technological advancement in the modern world, but what we don't have is sort of what we want, which is sort of mastery over
Meaning.
everything, and because we can't master ourselves.
Yeah.
And that then leads us to an end of a practice and said, this was good, but it only brought us so far. Where do we go further? So um, the propositional can't be sort of denied or whisked away. It has to be simply afforded its proper location. And so what happens in terms of you have something like the Protestant Reformation, where and reformations, because it's really a much more complex thing going on. And and you have all of this bloodletting, and at some point, you know, everybody realizes this isn't serving us to keep killing each other over these kinds of things. So let's try to contain things and use these things as organizing principles, but they don't at the same time really organize as much as we tend to act like they do. And in some ways, the invention of religious pluralism and the way that the United States approached it was another leap forward, in that, well, now, you can come here and you're a Catholic and you're a Jew, and there'll be bigotry against you, but we're not gonna play the games of what Europe is doing. But of course, that never was fully true either, for all kinds of complex reasons. So none of this stuff is going away. And the propositional is also not going away, because it's so built into all of our systems, and we're basically just going to have to live with it, but mostly understanding where it's helpful and where it's less helpful, and making those adjustments in our lives. And we have to do that interpersonally, because these categories, so I'm a Christian minister in a confessional church, and the Christian Reformed Church is sort of a boundary water place. We're not sort of we haven't been shaped like, let's say, American evangelicalism and fundamentalism has, although there are those influences in it. There's also some mainline influences in it. So I sort of come out of a place that has, kind of both and in it, despite a
Yeah.
bunch of the current things in my denomination. But as a person now, everyone sort of has to everyone sort of has to figure out, as much as they have time for and what's practical in their life, in order to move forward. And you're going to have to do that within a community. Now, part of what I see happening is a I don't think there's any going back finally and fully to paganism, because the church, in a lot of what it attempted to do propositionally, just discovered some new tools that could order the world in a way that paganism never could, which is why paganism just continues to lose. But with every revolution like that, there's always things that get overplayed and lost in the revolution. And so part of what we're looking at is there were, Christianity had a series of revolutions that went through it. Sort of, a major one was obviously the Protestant Reformation, and that has continued working through the systems. And so you have to, um, there's no forgetting the power of the propositional, sort of like there's no forgetting the tools that technology has given us. One can fantasize about going full Luddite, but even the Amish, who have been, at least in the United States, one of the more successful experiments at really grappling with technology, have to continue to face new frontiers with it all the time. And so when you get to your personal life and your story through evangelicalism, you've got all the layers, and you can't help but have all the layers, because you're a real human being working your way through a real environment that has all these layers. No matter how frustrated you get with certain communities around you, there are you have to select items on the menu about how to deal with all of those elements of the environment. That sounds like a ton of word salad. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're tracking with that. And
Yeah.
so pastorally, kind of what has happened with my channel and with sort of this little internet community around me is that not only do we have to deal with all these things around us, and by virtue of all the idiosyncratic elements of your life, you're going to have to deal with them, but it's also really helpful to have people to talk to and to compare notes with
Yes.
in order to deal with them. But that also then raises the question of community, because one of the powerful things that you can see with, let's say the Charlie Kirk funeral is community and agreement is so powerful because what it does is it affords a whole group of people to take whole things off of their salience landscape to limit combinatorial explosiveness so that they only have to deal with a certain number of things.
Right.
Community is so enormously powerful in that way, and that's why
Right.
we need it.
Well, and
But
but
that's
that's the
also why
danger
leaving
that
community is
yeah.
hard.
That's the danger that well, it's the give and take of that is to, holding that in that dynamical tension of like, okay, that the we're gonna hold this open enough to experience without collapsing into the dogmatism. I mean, I think that there's always that balance of or fundamentalism, and it's like you're always teetering on that edge of because I agree with everything you said. I mean, or everything you're saying, I think 100%. But at the core, it's almost like what is that valve, that the adjustment of the sectarian tendency or that the desire to try to orchestrate and I see this not just within Christianity. There's another channel, I won't even mention it, but like it's an agnostic channel and it's all about desecular and it's like at the end of the day, they're like, "Oh, I'm open to mystery," but I'm not because I'm actually going to control the mystery and tell you exactly how it operates. So that's human nature. I mean, that's every and I think what I'm really trying to put my finger on here is, and I could be wrong and I could be projecting, but it just feels like there's certain conversation where that I don't know where it comes from, but that tendency of wanting to be open and have all of these things that we're talking about, but to make sure that at the end of the day, the safeguards of what we're, keeping the thing crosses into crosses more into the understanding of a embodied participatory lived reality of a pattern within the relationship of like I think about Cornell West, I think about the way that he talks about Christ and he always frames it as shot through me as this from Shiloh Baptist. He talks about the philosophy, he talks about the suffering, he talks about the political, and whenever you hear him talk about it, you see that it is a lived pattern that forms and gives him the agapic love to humanize everybody he's talking to all the time. I never ever feel the sense of sectarian um, holding on to a organizational pattern or a structure or metaphysical conversation around superiority towards other types of expressions. Whether or not he believes that, I don't know,
Yeah,
that's the felt feeling. And so I guess
yeah.
what I'm what I'm wondering is like, what does it look like in the partnership on the corner of the internet with that? Is that something and maybe, like I said, could be me projecting into a certain situation in certain conversations, but I get that sense whenever I see these type of inner conversations between like it's like, yeah, we'll have the conversation, but at the end of the day, we kind of we kind of know that our organizational pattern is going to be the most effective, the most utilized, the most beneficial. Like, and like I said, I'm not trying to be like I'm genuinely wanting to ask you because I think I sense that you have a really deep understanding and a good heart and like a really interesting perspective that could really offer me a new way of looking at this because that's the thing that I keep thinking about when I'm trying to engage in these certain conversations about or when I'm thinking through this or looking out at the landscape when it comes to the advent of the sacred and the spaces that you're talking about like could this be more utilized getting rid of the or don't want to say getting rid of, you can't get rid of it, but like reframing the propositional or keeping the propositional where it's at, realizing we can't get rid of it, but de-emphasizing or, placing the value or because I listened to an interview with Vervaeke and Cooper that you guys did, and yeah, Cooper makes great points. He's like, this is the original this and this, and I think John's question was just very valid. Where is this showing up? Like,
Yeah.
where do I see this? And that's my experience.
Yeah.
I go to my churches that I grew up in the South, didn't see what Cooper's talking about. I look on the
Yeah.
internet, the people that attack me call me the devil when I'm talking about Greek Orthodox theology. and
Yeah.
and it's like there's this thing that I'm like, well, it's very real. So I don't know. I said a lot, but hopefully hopefully that made sense.
No, it made sense. There part of the Okay, so we can talk about spirits that spirits that possess others. Maybe it's helpful to talk about spirits that possess us. And part of the dream, my sort of at hand definition of religion is that which is highest and how to get there. And the religion, one of the religions of our culture has been that of openness and everything. That we have a belief that the more open we are, the more of everything that we can see. And that's a beautiful vision. It's a beautiful vision because it's a vision that is deeply desirable for us because we as human beings very quickly begin to realize our limitation. And so if we understand our limitation and we understand how our limitation is reducing or retarding us in different ways, then sort of we aspire to less limitation. Okay. And then we bump into, and Vervaeke articulates this, I mean, I learned this stuff from him, combinatorial explosiveness, that the difficulty we have, yes, we are limited. In fact, we cannot live without limitation. It's just something that we as human beings cannot do. We live for a certain while, we are limited by time and space, all of these things. And so the way we have an interpretive problem that we begin to work on even in the womb, and as we get out of the womb, we're trying to make the world intelligible, and the way that we do that is in some ways through frames. But the reality of frames, which are tremendously helpful because they organize a world too big for us to apprehend, is with a frame, now suddenly we can limit the world, and by limiting the world, we can actually make the world productive, and we can engage productively with the world. Once you accept that frame, you you give up to a degree on the religionness of everything in openness because you recognize you didn't make it as a choice, but once you understand how we work and how what the project we started with, even as babies in bassinets, learning to use our hands, we learn to differentiate between our hands and the rest of everything. Now suddenly we're in the problem of we are limited and we will always be limited, which means that choices will have to be made, which means that there will always be a yes and a no. And that no is something that as long as we are human beings as we are now, that will be a function to it. And then again, as a Christian, I go back and say, okay, if I understand that to be, what can Jesus teach me? And of course, you have this prologue of the Gospel of John where Jesus is seen as the logos, which is this interpretive, you know, element of the rest of reality. So Jesus sort of becomes a frame. Okay, that's you can understand the first chapter of the Gospel of John in that way. You also understand that Jesus also in his humanity has to handle the no. And it's very interesting the way this goes because of course John 2 then Jesus is at a wedding with his friends, and Mary says, "The wine is gone." And Jesus is like, "What does this have to do with me? My hour is not yet come." And Mary says, to the servants, just do whatever he says. So was that a no or not a no? Because he's going to turn water to wine. So you do, and everybody in the world is going to have to figure out their yeses and their nos. And if they're going to, because not only do we need yeses and nos to function, we need communities within which to function. And so then we tend to pick communities that in some ways represent those trade-offs of yeses and nos. And then now, okay, so that's sort of how we construct the world and the way the world works. But then you have the question of, is death a final no? And so part of the trade-off of secularity and a material approach to the world says that, well, in that scheme, death is a hard no, because you are dependent on this chain of causation that began with your conception. That's not true of the Christian scheme. It's not true of just about every other scheme. But then you also begin to realize that the combinations of yeses and nos within these schemes are going to have impacts in the yeses and nos, beyond this frame, because the truth is, just like we are not simply material creatures, we also mentally participate in in immaterial worlds. Our imagination, our loves, all of this. I when I was a college kid, I remember my grandmother, who was pushing 90, saying, I look in the mirror and I wonder, where did that old lady come from? Because inside I still feel like I'm 21 or 25. And
Yeah.
so that sets up this dynamic where, are we simply our bodies? Are we more? So I don't know if this is helpful at all, but the difficulty is that as you go through life, you're going to have to somehow make peace with your yeses and nos. And just by the fact that we by no means could have been carrying on this conversation without the use of nouns as well as verbs. Also, we can't live in our imaginal, what Charles Taylor calls the imaginary, that within which we're living,
Yeah.
without positions. We just can't do it.
Right. Right. Well, and yeah, I mean, my and I totally, it's not really, it's more just the appropriate adjustment of what the propositions are, and I think finding that optimal gripping on that of where we're going with it, because when you mentioned the stuff about I think modern secularism, or I would say new age kind of idea, this idea of openness. It's like, I think that fits into a model of stuff that I personally would very much reject as an ideological position, that would be congruent with my lived experience, just because it's got all sorts of issues that you end up running into if trying to live that way. However, that doesn't necessarily address the animistic, shamanic, like the traditions that actually have that built into it very well. And you see that containment. There's a podcast called The Emerald by Josh Schreier, and the stuff he'll start talking about sometimes, and how much it gets in sync with what Vervaeke's talking about on a totally different. He's definitely more academic, propositional driven. The Emerald's very bardic, it's very trance-inducing. There's a quality to it, very different styles, but nevertheless, you realize, you're like, "Oh, these qualities are there." And I get the idea of organizational patterns, as far as when you look at new things, like back to what we were talking about earlier, as these patterns continue to grow on patterns, the ability to hold that becomes harder. As It's like you can't go back to shamanic tribes of indigenous people that were like, I get that. I get that. Um, However, the imaginative, speaking of Taylor, getting out of the buffered self, like catching up to where technology, the internet, these archetypes, I think it's almost like those were the access that we are having to these archetypes it's like the hardware in which we are the yeses and nos, the way we're able to orchestrate and to connect and to bind and to know. It's almost like I see the church model currently is insufficient to keep up with how fast AI is taking us into that to the realm of the archetypes and being, as Dostoevsky would say, possessed by these forms in whatever political fashion it plays out as. And I think about, for me personally, the dream groups that I'm a part of, the conversations that I'm a part of, the relationship with Christ, the relationship, talking with you, engaging with Vervaeke, like looking at this advent of the sacred and just asking, what does it look like as we upgrade that system towards the, I Vervaeke used to call it the religion that's not the religion. I think he stopped calling it that. I don't know what it's called now. I don't know how he's talking about it now. And it was funny. He actually did a podcast yesterday where he was talking about Jung, and I was, wondering. I was like, I wonder why he's not talking more. Like, I just feel like his Jung's work is very relevant today in a lot of ways because I think it has potential, especially neo-Jungianism, to partner with the Neoplatonic, to partner with the Christian, like people like yourself, like to understand how those cross pollinate to create languages that live within communities, within the minds of, churches, however you want to, however they get structured and framed. But I guess at the end of the day, it's like that willingness to all show up at the table equally, is to say like, hey, like, I and I don't know, obviously it's like you can't create religion. So it's like a lot of this is just as it happens, it's gonna happen. But I look at these conversations as kind of being a part of throwing it out there and just seeing
Yeah.
like, okay, well, how are we gonna talk about this? And how are we, because I don't know about you, but my church never incorporated dreams. I never was told about dreams. I was never, and I look at the people that I work with and how many people have been able to both meet parts, which is not something that is within the grammar of church. Like, you're not going to learn about the multiplicity of mind. You're not going to learn about the different, like you're not going to learn about connecting to the unconscious via your dreams. Like, I was told dreams could be prophetic, and maybe God will give you a dream if he wants to, and then it might mean something like objectively towards this external situation. I was never given a symbolic framework of how to interpret dreams, how to sit with dreams, how to move through dreams. And one of the most powerful things that I've experienced, Paul, when working with people, is when I can connect them via, a lot of times I will utilize AI, like interpreting their dream through a Jungian lens. There's a shift that happens that is one of the most powerful things that I've seen with people, where they recognize this internal voice that's speaking to them, this autonomous voice that's speaking. Jung, Jung spoke of this in many ways as synonymous, could be synonymous with God, and watching that have the power to both strengthen that connection with Christ, strengthen that connection with the divine, but also the ability to detach from some of these archetypal forces that are flowing throughout the unconscious, that get identified via the dream maker, so to say. And so I just see like there's like a Jungian world that's living over here. Maybe the Christian world's living here. They're kind of, I get a little bit where a lot of Christians that I hear, like bishops and, or even Peugeot, maybe a little bit, where there's like this kind of like hesitancy to Jung in that sense of like, well, he's, not really. And I could be misreading some of this, but I get that sense. So I'm wondering what it looks like when those worlds start talking together better. Is that something that's necessary? Does that need to happen? Like, in your thoughts, like what, with all that I
Well,
just threw at you.
the church, even just talking about the church is a difficult thing
True.
because
Fair point.
you
Fair point.
have
Yeah. Very fair.
you also have sort of this stack of what churches do in themselves is prioritize and preserve certain things to the exclusion of other things. And then a question is, to what degree does the church use its influence to exclude individuals who participate in church from doing other things?
Yes. Yes.
So, for example, if you look at orthodoxy, a lot of the priority of orthodoxy seems to be um, the divine liturgy, let's say, the divine liturgy and the Eucharist. The priority of the Roman Catholic Church seems to be the Eucharist. They have liturgy, they have all these other things, but that's sort of the priority. The priority of Protestant churches tends to be proclamation, teaching, this kind of thing. And so you have all these churches that sort of emerge through history with in different places and different cultures with different priorities, and they what the church does is sort of binds people to that practice and to that in a certain segment of their life. It also provides them a community, provides a whole bunch of different things, provides a network. But you will find that people, while they go to church, they also, they have a political life, they have an economic life, they have a romantic life, they have a familial life, they have, just all these other things. And the church sort of weaves in and out of that, sometimes impinging quite a bit on it, sometimes
A secret
not.
mystical life sometimes where they don't
Yeah,
talk about, yeah,
no,
like,
that's true. I mean, all kinds of
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And, even as a pastor, you begin to learn this about people, whereas even in a tradition like mine that tends to be highly propositional, highly didactic, really wanting to, here are the three forms of unities, learn these three things. But how does that then relate to everything else in people's lives? And you see that like with Catholics, that someone might go to mass every single day. They get down to that church and they go to mass. But does that mean that the rest of their life has much in common with, let's say, somebody else who went to mass every single day 500 years ago? Um, and so life again is this massive, massive thing. Now, Jung, there's been a history of, I mean, Jung was the son of a reformed minister. Um, and so Jung has had a very complex relationship with different Christian communities. Some anxiety around Jung with respect to the occult, others not so anxious about him. And so then, but the vast majority of the church knows nothing of him. We'll just say that. And the same can be true of how many other figures on through history. And then you look at something like the Roman Catholic Church that sort of keeps one thing together, kind of, even though I watch Roman Catholics fight about just about everything. And then Protestants who just sort of fragment into little tribes and clusters. And so, a lot of it, a lot of times people will I see people coming at this from a political perspective or from a spiritual perspective or from some other programmatic perspective that says, why can't the church be and do or engage in X? And actually, in many ways, Protestantism is a response of that, because unlike these much older, longer traditions, people create Protestant churches out of thin air all the time. And, poof, there's one, and this church has a emphasis on this. And in fact, when you talk about dreams, I can point to I think it's now defunct, but I know people who participated in it was at that point, it was a parachurch, because it's another skill that Protestants have. Not only do we spin off churches about in all kinds of different ways, we even spin off parachurches. If
Youth with a Mission.
there
I was involved in youth. I had a relationship with,
there you go.
actually, that's one of the biggest parachurches, which is a whole
That's right.
new, whole
And
other
and you might
world.
ask, is Youth with a Mission a church? They'll say no, but it's like, well, wait a minute. Are your little clusters having
They
communion on
live
the beach?
together. I
You
think
have a
they're
li
more of a church than most churches, because when you get
There
into
you go.
that, you're in it, and
Yep.
and you'll stay for a while.
So then this one little parachurch, they were completely into dreams. They're completely into dream interpretation. Now I'm sure they would have had zero appetite for Jung if they even knew who he was, which they probably didn't. But Or maybe they would have liked him. Who knows? Maybe if you take out Carl Jung and just throw the ideas at him, they might have liked him. I mean, the life is weird that way, and the
Yeah.
church is this. But at the same time, it's really hard to sort of count the church out, because one of the things that it's demonstrated, and I think we see this right now sort of with the Orthodox moment that we see happening in the West right now, at least in the Anglo West, where Orthodoxy has been able to afford people who have sort of gone through post-modernity, the emergent movement kind of, fell out of that. And then they discover some things in the Orthodox Church that it's like, oh, when you look at this network of church fathers that Orthodoxy and Catholicism to a degree, but Orthodoxy sort of hasn't forgotten and is sort of kept out in the periphery. People go rummaging through that room and discover, oh, look at this church father. He said this, this is, and then they run with it. So the church has shown an ability to somehow keep reiterating and keep enduring. And, it's been a very hardy, pattern in the world, um, to somehow find space for particularities that people wouldn't have thought. And many of them die. When you look at, let's say, the church through a ecological, even evolutionary frame, you'll see that certain segments of the church are dying all the time. Alistair McGrath, he wrote a book a number of years ago called Heresy, and where he looks at some basic church, ancient church history items that he kind of goes through them. But his thesis, as I read it, some people have disagreed with me on my reading of that book, but is that what the church kind of does is becomes an ecological environment where many ideas are tried, but they're always sort of whittling away to get the longest lasting ones.
Yeah.
And so part of what's difficult is that you grew up in a particular time and space, which has, at least in the American Bible Belt, it seems when you say church, it all looks sort of like fundamentalist Bible Baptist thingy.
Penal
Um,
substitution and penal substitution or bust. I mean, there's
well, but even there, so the emphasis on penal substitutionary atonement, that's relatively late in that stream, actually.
but I'm
That's
just
sort
saying
of a
in my world, it
right,
was like
right,
you could talk to 98% of the people that I grew up with, and they don't know that there is another.
right,
They
right.
no, and it's not even just that, like, because I'm very active on Instagram, and a lot of the Christians that are not either Catholic or Greek Orthodox or just rejecting it flat out are very much still in that mindset. Like even mainstream Christian music artists, like it's still very like, I know we say we can't talk about the church, but I think in the popular culture representation of the Forrest Franks and um, some of the other, I mean, just nationalistic mindsets, it's like they've adopted, I think, what has come from that strand that you're talking about.
Yep, yep.
And I think they're in the majority. I would make the argument that, or at least or at least it's
It's a majority in a certain time and place.
right,
Because if you go to Russia and you
right.
say the church, what does
Yes.
that look like?
But
And if you go to
again,
France,
I'm
yeah,
concerned with I'm concerned with my people, like
yeah. No,
we're in
no,
a
no,
mess
that's
and
right.
we got to get out of this mess. And I think that's where I'm looking at it pragmatically in bodies, and I see this modal confusion and this propositional tyranny that is infested, that has become a disease almost in a sense of and again, I'm not even arguing like, okay, well, here's the atonement theory you should believe. It doesn't matter. But like the refusal to understand that there's multiple types of history and lineage and all that stuff. It's like, I get it. Like your congregation probably understands that. Greek Orthodox churches, they understand but I'm seeing the political influence of people that don't. And I'm just looking at these models and I'm saying, like, I wonder, you know, and and I guess where I'm thinking and I go back to is like, I know a lot of people that have deconstructed too, right? That's
Yep.
another very
Yep.
popular thing. I come from that world where 90% of my friends have deconstructed. And because of the archetypal experiences that I've had, it wouldn't let me deconstruct to a certain level. It's like I couldn't adopt the material. And I think deep down, anybody that deconstruct, they end up hitting that wall where they're like, where's the meat? Like, and I think that's where people go back and they're like, well, where do I land? And then it's like, oh, well, maybe I'll be Greek Orthodox. They're different or whatever. And
Yep, a
because
lot
it's
of people
hard.
do that. Well,
Yeah.
actually, not a lot of people do that. A lot of people that we see on the internet do that,
Sure,
which is
sure.
another filter issue.
Yep, sure. But again, I mean, but I think we're living in this world in which there's a fragmentation of people that deconstruct and then go and then live in this kind of, I don't know, this not meaningless. I mean, they find meaning, but almost like a disoriented in a very true sense of the word, where it's like you don't know where to put any traction to. It's like I know people are like, well, I should be going to church, but I don't know what I should do. Like you get that a lot from people.
Yep.
And I
And,
think
and
like
then and,
yeah,
and then you can ask the question. Well, you can just stop going to church. I mean, that's nobody. The police aren't going to hunt you down. Maybe your mother's going to worry about you. Maybe your friends are gonna, but a lot of your friends have also done that. But then people begin to sense something like, okay, I've stopped going to church, but then all I do is like go to Starbucks, watch Netflix, and go to work. Is that the answer? Is it just eliminating this? Because then they begin to
yeah.
realize that the church functioned in a lot of ways in their life that is sort of missing now. So then they have the question, as you're very much articulating, well, what should I do now? And then the question is, well, do we sort of start another church? And so actually, again, in the emergent movement, I mean, I've watched all of I've watched people, and I continue to watch people just work through all of these things. And then part of the reason they say look at orthodoxy is it's because, well, the nice thing about orthodoxy is I don't have to invent everything. There's already a menu there that we can sort of adopt, and then I'll do a little adapting. But there's other people that look at orthodoxy and say, hey, wait a minute, am I just sort of exchanging one set of things for another with that? And I have all these other concerns that aren't necessarily getting addressed. And so,
And at the end of the day, and I think that is for me the crux of whether you go or whether you don't. I don't think either one of them is going to make a difference until you connect to the numinous, until you connect to the divine, until you actually have a lived, felt experience with what's going on, and get out of that propositional awareness of belief into a a true numinosity of like, oh, this is real. And then you start to see the world differently. And it's like now every space you go becomes a it's like you're seeing, it's an anagogic process in which now you're seeing life in this very zen, right? Like it's like you're seeing in the mundane what and obviously community is a part of that because there's a certain binding that happens there that I'm not disagreeing with. I guess where I'm getting at is like there's that for me it's more about like you know in communicating it in a way that allows um a fertile environment for those moments to happen, and for that language to push people into not just the propositional understanding of like what the symbolic is, but the immersive entanglement into the interaction with like what's going on, and how to do that. And we talk about parachurches. It's like YWAM I think did that really well. They offered people an experience of God, a hands-on, participatory, lived communal experience in which people were now immersed in it, and they were like, "Oh wow, this is really great." And I find that as obviously as you get older, it's like, well, now I have bills and jobs and responsibilities and all this other stuff, and putting that together, just the time of that factors in as well. And so you got a lot of factors here that's coming down on this stuff. But I guess I go back to trying to figure out like what does that shift look like uh as far as language, just language, and just starting from ways of adjusting, and maybe it doesn't need to be adjusted, but um, amongst different groups and then connected to bigger group. And I don't know, I don't know. I think imagination has got to be a part of this, and I think that's got to be something that is continually engaged with in new ways, both from inside the church or inside the church and outside the church. In my opinion.
But well, let's imagine someone, someone is dissatisfied with whatever package of things that they were handed, and they go their own way, and they discover their ecology of practice, and they're really satisfied with their ecology of practice because it's affording insight and it's showing them new things, and they're excited about that. Um, very quickly, a few things emerge for them. Number one, I'm just kind of doing this by myself, and my wife thinks I'm weird for doing it. She really hasn't joined me, but whatever. But I want to find a group of friends that'll talk about this with me. But even because I'm engaging in my ecology of practices, and it's affording insight and self-transcendence and all of these things. And well, now I want to have a group of friends that I can enjoy this with, because for human beings, that enjoying with always magnifies what you mean. Because if you enjoy it by yourself, it's on one hand, there's the enjoyment of it, but on the other hand, there's sort of an isolated ache that we
I
have.
think it's an ontological relational reality. I think that there's something that's living that could not otherwise be living without the relation. It's like
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely.
it's not even like, oh, this is better. It's like, no, this is actually a living thing that's now alive within
Yes.
the relationship.
And that is some of that is that spirit that is between, not
Yes.
just within.
Or two or
And
more.
we
Yeah.
That's right, and we long for that spirit between. And then, okay, and then what? Well, then part of why we want a language about it is because we want to have that spirit in between. And language is, you
Invitation?
know, it is a limitation, but it's
No,
also
invitation.
oh,
Like,
it is, yes,
when you have
invitation,
the
absolutely.
language, you have invitation.
And we also have this really interesting tool called the internet now, and podcasts and YouTube channels, whereas if you were living pre-internet, pre-radio, maybe you could write a book, but then you'd have to get it printed and distributed. But now via the internet and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and everything, now suddenly I can send this thing out into the world. And if there's just a little bit enough that other people catch on to, then it's like, oh, I can find you. But then, like we're doing right now through, it's all language. It's all wording. So I'm looking for that language and why am I looking for that language? I'm looking for that language because I think if I can just say the right words, then you can see what I can see, and then the spirit between us will grow. But again, part of the difficulty that we're going to have will be sustainability and scale. Because again, one of the things that we see, and this then sort of provokes I wish, and I wish the church could change, because that language is sort of, we see the church as this massive thing out there, and we sort of want the magic words that are going to make things change. And we know it can happen because it's happened time and time again. It happened through Augustine. It happened through Jesus. It happened through Paul of Tarsus. It happened through John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Wimber, on and on and on and on. Sometimes that does happen. But again, you then discover that the church is this massive living thing that, just like individuals and people, is sort of colonization resistant. You can sort of throw magic words at them. And again, even Jesus on top of the Mount of Olives looks down and weeps, because Jerusalem, I looked to gather you like a hen gathers its chicks, but you would not be gathered. And so, Jerusalem will suffer what it will suffer. So no, you're right. And this challenge that we feel. It sort of starts in isolation and loneliness, and we desire for it to sort of spread out and reach out. And in many ways, because we've discovered a joyful, helpful, clarifying thing, it's a good thing to want to share that with others, and so that others can experience the joy that we have. But then the question is, okay, well, And how is that going to happen? And so, basically a lot of what we're just doing on the internet is trying out language with each other. Will this word get it? Will they see what I see with this? If they don't see what I see, can I still grow and learn from them? I mean, that's Vervaeke's dialogos. Can even if we're not sort of doing the same thing with each other, can we still sort of grow and benefit from each other and pass on what I've received to somebody else? So,
Well, and there's an evolution of consciousness that I think is that I'm always fascinated by, as far as the adaptation of you know what is being creative, or what is being created. Like, we obviously will never go back. There's no, it's not utopia, not nostalgia. Like, you don't recreate the thing that was. And I think that the AI boom, or the technological advancements that we're seeing, is forcing us to kind of evolve and figure out what it will look like, and how this becomes incorporated into that transition of, like, yeah, you're right, like, you don't live here. If you live here, it's going to be, you're going to watch video to video to video to video, and at the end of the day you're just going to get done with it and have nothing really. It's just information. However, if it's connected, like you said, into that ecology, and then the language comes in, and then now the dreams are reflected, and then you're walking and you're seeing nature, and nature is revealing itself. Like, I've personally experienced a ton of growth by understanding, especially parts language. I think that's been helpful, because you can understand that language lives in the intellectual, and understanding when to get out of that, and when to allow that to inform in the appropriate amount. Well, now then it's like, oh, there is a lived reality that does flourish and show up within interactions, within family, and within what. So I will say, yeah, I agree with you, which is even more important, is to, like, well, let's look at that language really carefully, especially in the context of, like, I'm a religious figure, or I'm a pastor, or a church, whatever, and you have people that watch, or people that listen to me, and they'll look at certain things, and they're like, okay, well, I'm going to adopt this because, oh, well, don't do yoga because yoga might, this might happen. So then people, okay, well, no yoga, and so then that lives, and it prevents people. And I grew up with this, and you see this happening in all sorts. So it's like I don't know how much we can create the experience for somebody, but I do know how much that can influence somebody's willingness to participate in an embodied practice, and in an awareness that, I don't know if there's a right answer to this, but I just keep feeling it in my awareness of, like, really trying to be as sensitive as I can with this, especially with the language around archetypes, because going back to the conversation of, like, if you tell people to just be open with anything and none of it matters, well, now I that's the last thing I would ever want to encourage anybody to do, because that's not true. At least from my lived experience, I've seen that end really badly for people. I've seen it end badly for myself, my own internal stuff that kind of came in by choosing to, approach life that way. Again, I mean, it's like, it obviously trickles down, but I think that's why I get excited by what by what you're bringing to the internet, and to the world, and the conversations with Vervaeke, because I hold him as kind of a mentor in a lot of ways, and I've had very powerful synchronistic dreams that have, like, pushed me into that. Um, and I haven't met Jonathan. I appreciate what he does, and I think, like, it lines up in a lot of ways. I just have been like, these are just some of the things, and I hope I didn't come across the wrong way with any of the questions. It just is like,
no.
some of the stuff that I think about, of, like, I'd really like to know, because it's like, maybe it's, like I said, maybe it is from my own personal bond, baggage of my relationship with other religious figures, or people that have been in that role of either authority or status or position, and hearing these things that I've seen that have become harmful for people, or that have done more of a negative impact as opposed to, gravitating towards like with where John comes at it. And and I'll share this with you, and this is a powerful dream that I had that it really put it into perspective for me, and it's been something that's guided, like, it really was powerful. So I had a dream one night that I was in the conclave. Now I'm not, I've never really been to a Catholic church. Like I said, you know what I grew up in, but I was on, this is, I guess, what do they call it? The trial, not the trial, but the where they're picking the next pope, the con like the practice of
Conclave,
it.
yeah.
I was in the conclave, and I was, you know, fully in it, Paul. I mean, I was ready to go. I was like, I am 100% just like dedicated to the mission of the church. And I was walking through the halls, and as I'm walking into the building, the the roof of the church like just ripped off. I mean, just this hurricane of a wind just ripped it off. And I look up and I see the self, the divine, the numinous. I see this. It was such a divine, luminous uh, thing, and it basically was like, "Hey, I appreciate the willingness to do this, but I need you somewhere else." And it pulled me and put me outside of the church. I was like, "You got to be here." And I woke up, and it was just a very powerful dream because I've sat with this so many times where I realize, like, oh, it would be, you know, ideologically, theologically, like a lot of my beliefs line up with orthodoxy and all this other like I don't have, I mean, probably more Jungian in a certain sense and certain, talking about evil and all that. Like there's certain people would definitely still call me a heretic, like, but I don't profess it out of respect for what that is. But to me, there's just a feeling of like, okay, this is not, this is for a reason. There's something there's some type of vantage point that I'm seeing, or that and I feel the same way with John almost. I see what he's doing and I resonate with that a lot. And I just deeply appreciate the conversations that you guys have. And like this type of conversation is very healing for me, and it's very meaningful to me. And I hope it is for you as well. And so yeah, I think like I hold that as a reality that is, who am I to say that I'm, that it's incorrect, right? Like, or that this person is incorrect or whatever. And I don't sense that you're saying that at all, but I'm just, I think that's kind of, some of the things that I hold with this conversation.
Well, I think the Bears coach was wrong with not doing field goals. I think if the Bears had kicked some field goals, they would have done, I think they could have won their game, but that is something that I'll say is wrong. But, the, no, and that's, I look at what I've sort of accidentally created in some different spaces, and part of it has been on the internet, creating a network of people who want to have these conversations. And, there is something to creating a something. And so in my space, sometimes it's called This Little Corner of the Internet. And it's sort of a network of channels and people that are interested in comparing notes, in doing what we're doing right now. And it's nice to have a network because, not all of the nodes in the network are always available to talk as much as anyone would want. And then you discover friends along the way, and then you discover, um yeah, then the friendships can go other places, and then you have events, and then you do other things. And so, because I think in a time like we're living in now, where there's a lot of technological disruption, and that disruption affords opportunity. Um, it's it's just a good and helpful thing to be able to talk with one another and compare notes and say, this works for me, this doesn't work for me for these reasons. How about you? What can I learn from you? What have you learned along the way? And we want a broad enough, open enough field where we can maybe discover things that are surprising and helpful. But of course, you can't talk to everyone all the time about everything because it's just too massive. And so within the community, there are seasons and streams and niches. And so that's, I didn't set out to create this. And in fact, I didn't create it. I sort of, not unlike sort of an emergent spirit, I
Mm,
participated in that.
yeah.
And then, we just sort of discovered the tools that we had on YouTube and other places where we could just, oh, okay, well, I should go talk to this person. And so I'll reach out to them and see if they're willing to talk to me. And then we'll record it and then we'll put it out here and then other people might find it. And, in some ways, that's the foundation of, well, the church had a leg up because in some ways it could level up from synagogue worship. So there were already synagogues around, and so you could sort of use existing networks. But even and then you find other commonalities. You mentioned YWAM, and there's several people in the TLC network that used to also participate with YWAM. So that then becomes a nexus point. And then you can begin talking about something from a comment and say, well, I learned this from it. Well, I learned this from it. And so, no, I think this process is natural, it's human, it's healthy because the reason we want to involve others is because we really we understand that we are prisoners of our own experiences and of our own individual pathways. And so we have more knowledge connecting with others and
Yeah.
talking with others that brings us places that we couldn't have imagined being able to go.
And there is a tremendous need for sacred spaces in general that just have, like I think about with the outreach center, just having a place where the environment was already set, where people would walk into, and the framing of the stuff that was quote unquote allowed to happen in that space was what I find is a big challenge within modernity or modern society now, is that there's really no spaces unless you're gonna go to some new age thing, which you don't know what you're gonna get. You don't really know what the background of any of that is, and then where you go into it with the willingness of, using parts language to let certain things down, to then participate and allow the things that will emerge to come up. And I that's another passion of mine that uh has been, and I know it will unfold, but like these types of conversations that, and leading to spaces where you do have physical events where there's an openness to where people can, participate in a way that's not like, I mean, because IFS training, there's not a lot of people that I talk to that really understand some of the other forces or that talk about that. And the spirit, and I watch it also get translated into a secularized CBT, DBT dialect. Like it's a very like, very sanitized, despiritualized, which it works. I mean, there's a practicality to that I'm not saying it's not effective and efficient, but I think to keep addressing these layers, the need of the awareness and the sacred space, that admittedly, um, trying to create that is hard and dangerous and costly, and could also, and why you have cults. So there's just so many things that I think mutually beneficial from relationships like this and conversations like this and opportunities, and having, spaces in which people can talk about these types of things within congregations to people that are already primed to hear these things in a new way. So I 100% I hear you, and I'm grateful for you, and I feel you. I just know from the deconstruction world, people that are in that, it's like that, having that feeling of, are you gonna try to proselytize me? Or are you gonna try to nail me down on some type
Yeah.
of like, and I think that suspicion is always kind of there. So it's like whole like keeping that in, like, yeah, I don't know. I something I think about of like, a lot of the pastor friends that I've had that are still within like denominations, like they can't have this conversation with me. Like, they want to know. They're like, I'll talk to them, and they're like, but it's still about Jesus, right? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, and it's just frustrating because I'm like, we're not clearly not having the same conversation, and I think that is where I'm trying to contend for and participate with and come at this not from a see you later, but like standing on holding a tonos of like, let me stand here and see what could be alive, or what relation, what spirit, what guy, what could be uh manifested from that, which is what I see you doing. And so I just want to say that I appreciate that in what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you.